Welcome to the Gentleman Project podcast. I'm Kirk Chug.
And I'm Corey Moore. Today we have Derrick Esplin, who, although I haven't seen for a while, I consider a very good friend. We were actually missionary companions together in Houston, Texas. It's been a few years, Derrick, and our families have grown up, and it's good to reconnect with you.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and to reconnect with you, Corey. You were one of my all-time favorite companions, and it's good to see you again and to reconnect.
So tell us a little bit about your life. Tell us about your family and what you do for a living, just to give everyone context on what Derrick Esplin's doing in his life and what his family makeup looks like.
I went to school initially to be an accountant. I earned my bachelor's and master's degree at Southern Utah University. And when I got done with my degree, I started in public accounting, was working as a tax accountant at a CPA firm, and then migrated into private industry, worked as a controller and then a CFO for a few years. And then I got kind of a wild hair and thought it'd be fun to try teaching. And so I started teaching accounting at Dixie State, which is now Utah Tech University, about 10 years ago. And I just found that is what I loved. Like, that was the reason I wanted to wake up in the morning, outside, of course, the family, was I just loved being an accounting educator and having associations with students. And so I sort of made a career transition. I went back and got a PhD, and I've been teaching full-time here at Utah Tech. I just finished up being the department chair, which I'm glad that's over. That was a lot of meetings. And I'm just happy to be back in the classroom and teaching full-time. I actually met my wife. She grew up in Seattle, Washington, and we met in St. George, and then we got married and went up to SUU. So we've been married now 22 years. You know, she's a sweetheart. She's the best part of my life. We were blessed with 4 children. Before we got married, this is kind of a funny story, and it's absolutely true, but before we got married, you sort of have conversations of, how many kids we want to have and those types of conversations. And she was adamant. She's like, we're going to have 2 boys and 2 girls. And I said, that's not possible. You can't predict things like that. And she said, no, that's what's going to happen. We're going to have 2 boys and 2 girls. And so I kind of just chalked it up as her being crazy. But I then asked, well, why are you so convinced, so sure? Like, what's the reason? Why do you want to have 2 boys and 2 girls? And her answer was so that they could each go on a ride together at Disneyland. And that was the whole reason we wanted 2 boys and 2 girls, so that they could hang out. And lo and behold, that's what we ended up having. We had our oldest son, Mason, and then we had Colin. And then we had 2 girls, Olivia and Gemma. And like I said, they've just been being a husband, being a father has brought me some of the greatest joy and happiness in my entire life.
Tell us a little bit about your upbringing. What did your folks teach you that has influenced your life? And I know, or other mentors or people in your life that have really made you who you are. And what are the things that you learned growing up that are really important to you?
Yeah, so my dad was a high school math teacher. I grew up in Lavurkin, Utah, and people used to ask me, where's Lavurkin? And I'd make the joke, it's across the bridge from Hurricane. But down here in Southern Utah, I'm proud graduate of Hurricane High School. It looks like hurricane, but locals pronounce it Hurricane. But his dad, so my grandpa Esplin, and my grandpa Esplin's brothers, so he had 2 brothers, and they ran a huge cattle ranch on the Arizona Strip. And so it was a family operation. Like even me as a grandchild, my grandpa would come and he'd round up all the grandkids, my dad. And so during the summertime, we would just go out on the Arizona Strip and we'd work as a family. And a lot of long hours of riding horses, branding cows, fixing fence. Like, it was things that I did not enjoy all the time as a 12 and 13-year-old kid. But it taught me how to work, and it taught me the value of family. And my grandpa would often say, we're not just raising cattle, we're raising men. And that was true. Like, I didn't always appreciate that upbringing, but I look back now and I just think what a wonderful opportunity that was to grow up in a situation where I was working with my dad, my brothers, my uncles, and then my grandpa, and even my couple of great uncles. And again, just not realizing what a unique opportunity that was. I've got 3 brothers. I'm kind of right in the middle of the 3 brothers, and we've got 2 sisters. We were heavily involved in athletics. So we spent a lot of time together in the backyard, playing older brothers, younger brothers, a lot of competition. It ended in probably a lot of fights sometimes just, arguments. But as a result of that, my brothers are some of my best friends. I went on a vacation just this summer with my oldest brother and youngest brother, and we went to Costa Rica for a week. So I think my parents really just, and then grandparents just set the example of the importance of family. And we've tried to emulate that with my wife and I, and continuing on some of those traditions with our own kids.
That sounds a little bit familiar. I think Corey and I have some of that same background where we get to work with our dads and grandfathers and that on cattle ranches. And there's nothing quite like working on the farm to bring you together and build relationships. So I appreciate you sharing that. In the last 2.5 years, you've had a family challenge that nobody wants. If you're willing to talk about this today, I think it would be valuable for the listeners of the podcast to, one, be able to talk to and support families that have gone through what you've gone through, and also if they're ever unlucky enough to have it happen to them, how to deal with it. Would you tell us about your son Mason first? Tell us about him. Tell us about what he loved.
Yeah, and I apologize. I'm sure I'll get emotional as I talk here, but Mason, when he was born, 6 months old, a year old, 2 years old, random people would come up to us and just tell us, you have the most beautiful boy that I've ever seen. And, as a parent, of course, every parent thinks their kids are beautiful and wonderful. And our other 3 kids absolutely are beautiful and wonderful kids. But if I had to describe Mason in one word, I would say beautiful. He was just a stunning looking kid on the outside, and on the inside was, I would say, an empath. He was very aware of other kids. Oftentimes, in elementary school, high school, middle school, he would befriend kids that seemingly didn't have other friends. The things that he and I enjoyed doing quite a bit was snowboarding. We have season passes up to Bryan Head. We'd spend 10 or 15 days a year up on the mountain snowboarding together. We were into dirt biking, so he was on a dirt bike from the day he was 5 years old. And here in St. George, there's trails everywhere. You can just get out within a few minutes and you're on some wonderful trails. And then he really liked skateboarding. So those are kind of his 3 things that he loved to do. When he was 17, so 2.5 years ago, on March 7th, so of 2020, he was out dirt bike riding with his friends. He was with a few friends. He was on his dirt bike. They'd been out for a couple of hours, and my wife actually texted Mason and just said, "Hey, where are you at? Are you coming back?" And he texted back and said, "Yeah, we're on our way home." On his way back home, he was crossing kind of a major road. He had stopped at a light. He was coming through a neighborhood, but had stopped at a light. And his friends told us that his bike had stalled. And so the bike stalled out, and they just said they saw him kicking the bike. he got it started right as the light turned green. And I think, I feel like the bike was basically on empty, running out of gas, and that's why it stalled. But he got it started, and we kind of lived up a hill, kind of a rolling hill at the time. And I think just being a teenager, not wanting to push the bike up the hill, he was going to go as fast as he could to get home before the bike ran out of gas. But unfortunately, he went around a turn just too quickly, and not really exactly sure what happened, but the bike went out of control. He was wearing a helmet. I mean, precautions were taking, the necessary precautions were there, but he ended up severing an artery just below his collarbone. And he wrecked maybe 150 yards from our house. And the injury was such that he basically bled out. The two friends that were there, one of them, and just frantic, but one of them came running down to our house telling us Mason was hurt. So I'm running down there as fast as I can. One of our dear neighbors got to the scene first and, put a towel on him and was trying to but Mason was knocked out. Like, he was not unconscious, barely breathing. The ambulance gets there and takes Mason away. And anyway, the long and the short of it, he ended up being in the hospital for about 6 days. The trip from River Road to the hospital, and then while the doctors were trying to resuscitate, he actually went through about 40 units of blood. So they just couldn't get the bleeding under control, and was bleeding out basically as quickly as they could get the blood in. And as a result of that, he ended up having what's called an anoxic brain injury. He went brain dead. He just lost too much oxygen. It took about 6 days for us so the accident happened on a Saturday. He ended up passing the following Friday. So it took about 6 days before the first couple of days were hit and miss. They got him, the doctors were able to get him stabilized. But then, like I said, just over the course of time, the brain functionality just wasn't there. So in between that time, while he's in the hospital, we learned that he was going to be a vegetable, and we didn't want him in that state. The active life that he had, it just wasn't what we wanted for him. Really no chance of recovery, no brain function, never be able to talk again, walk again, even hearing was up in the air. So the quality of life just wasn't there. And my wife found on his driver's license that he had marked yes to be an organ donor. And so when the doctors told us yes, we can keep him in a vegetative state, but he's not ever going to come out of it. That was the next step for us, was to go ahead and just have him be an organ donor. And that's been, I would say, a silver lining. We've met one of the families that a little girl, she's 9 now, received one of his kidneys. And we met her last spring break. She's grown like 6 inches and put on like 12 pounds. I mean, she was going to dialysis like 2 days a week prior to receiving one of Mason's organs. And, there's others out there. She's the only one that we've met personally, but he was able to donate his heart, liver, lungs, and kidneys. And so that would be one thing I'd never, ever thought of even for a second. Being a gentleman, if you have the ability to donate organs that cannot be used, in Mason's situation, he wasn't going to be with us. And so we felt that was something that he would have wanted. And we honored his last wish in that way. So we feel like through that, Mason's been a hero. It softens the blow a little bit, just knowing, like, when we met that girl, it was a highlight of my year to meet, and I hope to go to her wedding someday. she consider, and her family considers Mason their angel, because their daughter, I don't think, would be here today if she hadn't received that kidney. So that's something that, like I said, it wasn't on my radar before, but I'm an advocate of organ donation. And then the other thing I mentioned, he went through about 40 units of blood. And so every year on March 7th, we do a blood donation in his name, and we try to get at least 40 units of blood. So that entails 40 family members or friends coming and donating. And so that's been a nice way for us to sort of remember Mason and his life. And it's been tough. I mentioned my wife telling me that she wanted two boys to go to Disneyland together. Our two sons they shared a room all growing up. Like they were buddies. And so for him to not have his older brother, and then him kind of having to step into the older brother role, which he had never really been, has been really challenging for him. I think our daughters have coped with it better. They certainly have struggles as well some days, but for him, it's been particularly challenging to just trying to deal with the aftermath of losing his older brother.
Thanks for sharing that with us. That's a big deal, and I appreciate you being willing to do that. Like, what advice would you give to parents who might be going through this or who do go through it? Like, how does that affect you? How does it affect your marriage? How does it affect your kids? And what advice do you give to people, if there is some? I mean, that's pretty much everyone's worst fear as a parent, right? And so,
it is everyone's
what advice would you give?
So we came across a book, and I'll give her name of the book as well. We happened upon it. Well, my sister gave it to my wife at the time of the accident. My wife didn't read it until about 6 months ago. The book is called "It's Okay That You're Not Okay," and the author is Megan Devine. That book has been profound in a lot of ways for us. You're never going to get over the loss of a child. And it's okay. Like, it's okay that you're not okay. It's okay if you're sad. It's okay if you're grieving. Grief and death is uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to even think about. Prior to losing my son, if somebody that I knew had lost somebody, I was really uncomfortable. I didn't know what to say. I think the best thing that you can say to somebody that's lost someone recently is, "I'm sorry. And I'm here for you." And being here for you, I think a lot of times might just mean going over to somebody's house and letting them cry. As a husband, as a father, I'm sure you're the same way. You want to fix things. You want to help your wife and your kids. And unfortunately, when you lose a child, there's no fixing that. You can't fix it. And I do have hope that we'll see him again and all of those things. But for the here and now, there's no fixing it. And so you just need to be there to support. And like I said, I think sometimes people just aren't sure how to help. But don't be afraid to just sit with somebody in their grief and then just listen to them. You can't fix it. So don't offer any fixing things. Just listen to them in their grief and their pain, and not to try to dilute it or diminish it, and just hear them in their pain and offer, again, "I'm sorry." And that's really, I think, the best that you can do. And unfortunately, that's about all you can do.
Derrick, I'm sure that you have some good advice of like that, what to do. I'm sure you have some very strong opinions on what not to do. Help us when we're in that situation. I think a lot of times, like you said, we try to fix things that can't be fixed. What are some things that we shouldn't say as we try to support families that have gone through this type of grief?
Any of these things I'm about to say have all been said to us, and I don't personally, I didn't take offense, or I tried not to take offense, because I knew that whatever somebody was telling me wasn't meant to be offensive, if that makes sense. But things that are just not helpful would be things like, I know that your son's in a better place. That one just, it drives me nuts, because the best place he could be is in my house, in his own bed. So I don't want to hear that he's in a better place, because I want him here. So that one kind of agitates me. I call them platitudes. So, you'll see him again. This is part of God's plan. Trials make you stronger. Everything happens for a reason. While all those things may be true, it's not what a grieving person wants to hear. One of the things that I said to my wife that I didn't learn was offensive until months later was, I told her, honey, we need to move forward. We have 3 other kids, right? Like, yes, Mason's gone, but we have 3 other kids. We need to just move forward with our lives. And what I found that did, or realized that did, is she's in grief, but then it also creates a feeling of shame that maybe she's not doing enough, in addition to the grief that she's feeling. Back to what I said earlier, I'm sorry that you're going through this, and I want to just be there and in support of you. And I think, again, the platitudes, they haven't been helpful. We did have somebody tell us, and this was after he had passed, probably about a year, and they said, isn't it wonderful that after your loved one passes on, that you can feel them in your life? And no, it's not wonderful. Maybe you can feel them occasionally, but it's not. It's terrible. Like, that's not wonderful. So just things like that, they're not helpful. And like I said, I think sometimes as society, we just want to fix the problem. We want to offer encouragement. But I think the best way to support, I've mentioned this already, is just to sit in that grief with them. And the other thing I would say is, don't if you're there to support somebody in their grief, let that be their grief, and not to try to say, well, my mom passed or my dog passed, so I know what you're feeling, because that, everybody's grief is their own. And so anyway, a lot of those things I've learned over the 2.5 years, and it's a process. And so that's yeah, there are things that have definitely been said that aren't helpful. And a lot of times, there's things that are quite triggering that you wouldn't even, from the outside looking in, even realize. And so again, I know that people aren't trying to be offensive, and so you've got to take that with a grain of salt. But the week that Mason accident happened, I'm praying my guts out. We're doing everything we can to try to hope and that he's going to make it. So hearing things sometimes that, somebody will say, I lost my keys and I prayed, and God answered my prayer. I found my keys. It really is maddening, because I prayed my guts out. And so anyway, it's an interesting, and it's a difficult situation to be in, because the thing that we hoped for didn't happen, and then that kind of opens up to, well, where was my miracle? Why weren't we blessed? And so it really does mess with your mind quite a bit.
Yeah, I really can't imagine. I can't get my head around it. It's hard for me to have the right empathy, quite frankly. I can try to imagine one of my kids being gone, but I really can't get my head around it, honestly. You mentioned the book, and I like this idea of, it's okay to not be okay. That's obviously kind of helped you through the grieving process. Is there other things that have helped you or your family to to keep going? Is there things that helped you to keep walking forward when you really don't want to?
Yeah. The one thing I would say is, if you know that somebody has lost a loved one, a child, spouse, whatever the case may be, don't be afraid to bring up that person's name. I can assure you, my wife thinks about Mason 99% of the day, and this is 2.5 years later. So she's always, when she wakes up in the morning, when she goes to bed, he is the last thought on her mind right now. And so I would say, don't be afraid to bring up a memory of the loved one. And what you might be thinking, well, they seem to be doing okay. If I mention the loved one's name, maybe that'll make it worse. It will not. So my wife's biggest fear is that Mason's going to be forgotten. And so it's been really, really nice when family members, and we've had this happen numerous times, brothers, sisters, my mom, they'll be going through old photos and they'll find a photo of Mason when he was, 5, and they'll just send them to us. And hey, I just found this photo thinking of you. So I would say try to still create situations where the loved one can still be remembered and talked about, because that is my wife's biggest concern, is that Mason's just going to be forgotten. I mentioned the blood drive. That's been something we've been passionate about, organ donation. But life does go on. You do have to just continue, and it's terrible sometimes. For my wife, I would say she's still in heavy grief. One of the things that book mentioned is everybody grieves differently, but especially for mothers losing a child, the heavy grief can be anywhere from 2 years to 20 years. I mean, there's been reports of people being in heavy grief seemingly for the rest of their, even a 70-year-old mother losing a 50-year-old son, they'll be in heavy grief for 20 years. And what does heavy grief look like? It's things like a lot of anxiety, depression, sleep loss, no appetite. And so prior to reading this book, I was deeply concerned that my wife would never be herself again. And after reading the book, I've come to realize, well, no, check the box, every single item, she is in heavy grief. And so I think just knowing that people grieve differently can be helpful. And then just knowing that grief, while everybody grieves differently, there is no set timeline. And so that helped me just have a more long-term perspective. Like most days I would say I'm doing better than my wife. There's days that I'm doing worse. And so she'll recognize those days. The days that I'm doing worse, my grief is manifesting at this point in anger. I'll just be real short. And she'll recognize that, and she'll just kind of leave me alone for a few hours. Her grief is more still sad. And, I don't know that there's been a day since his passing that she hasn't cried. And so, as family members, I would say just if you're trying to support somebody, check in. Another question that has sort of driven my wife a little bit crazy over the years is, how are you doing? How are you doing today? I'm doing crappy. My son's still gone. So, just take the assumption that they're not doing well. They don't want to leave their house. There's high anxiety. And so, a lot of times it's, I'm just going to show up at your doorstep, and I'm going to kind of force my way in, and I'm just going to sit with you. And that's, so anyway, the book has been quite profound for me to just realize that we're not the only ones that have ever gone through something like this, and you can get through it, but it's a process that I've come to realize is far longer than I think a lot of times us as society would like to admit.
Derek, can I ask you a personal question about how this has affected your parenting style, like as a father? Has anything changed in your perspective on fatherhood since Mason's passing?
You learn to be, I think, more present. I mean, I've thought back numerous times of that morning of the morning of Mason's accident, and not we didn't know that that was our last day with him. So you just never know. You never know when it's your date, when your time's called, or your wife or your kids. So being present, being there in the moment while your kids are there, those memories, that time is so very precious. So just trying to make the most of the time that we have, however much time that is. We're also a lot more cautious. It was a freak accident, and I don't know how you avoid freak accidents, but my 16-year-old daughter's getting ready to go on to a homecoming dance, and my wife is like, "You are not getting on a side by side. You are not driving down to Las Vegas." So after losing a loved one, you realize that you don't have a whole lot of control, and so I think maybe sometimes you try to over control the things that you feel like you can, and that's not necessarily a good thing, but I think it's inevitable. So that's been, we've had conversations of, look, yes, we lost a son. Yes, it's possible we could lose another child to some freak event, but they still need to live their lives, and we can't keep them in a bubble. And for me, it's been realizing that time is so very precious. And I think I knew that before, but much more so after you've gone through an experience of losing a child.
Two questions in one here, Derek. We always ask everyone at the end of the podcast what it means to them to be a gentleman. So I'll let you, if you haven't already thought about that, I'll let you think about that for a minute. And maybe to go along with that, now you've been through this, lots of experiences in your life. How old are you now? 42, something like that?
43, yep.
43. And you've got these almost adult kids. You've had one big accident. You have multiple careers. So looking back now on all this, is there certain things that you say, man, I just really want to make sure my kids leave my home with these things, these attributes or these values intact, right? Things that I want my kids to walk away and look back and say, definitely my dad taught me these 2 or 3 things. Do you have a thought of what those might be?
At the end of the day, you just want to be and strive to be a good person. Be able to look yourself in the mirror at the end of the day, and that you've treated people with respect. You've treated people the way you want to be treated. And so that's what I've tried to instill in my kids, is just be kind. And that's, I would say, back to Mason, he amplified that. It was evident after his passing, even up until about 6 months ago. I was getting my oil changed, and we have a sticker of Mason in the back of our vehicles. It's just a picture of him on his dirt bike. Anyway, the person that was changing my oil that day saw the sticker, and he came up to the front of the shop and said, "Are you Mason's dad?" And I said, "Yes, I am." I'd never met the kid. And he said, I hadn't seen Mason in several years, but when I moved to town in the 7th grade, Mason was my very first friend. He recognized that I was the new kid at school, and he just started hanging out with me. And that made my heart feel good, that those types of things that we've been trying to instill in our kids sunk in, that if you see somebody that seems like they're having a bad day, if somebody's sitting by themselves at lunch, please go and just say, "Hey, do you want to sit by me? What's your name? I'm Derrick. How are you doing?" So I think that for me, I obviously I want my kids to be successful. I want them to be all the things, right? But at the end of the day, just be a good person. And I think that's what both my wife and I have tried to instill.
Well, it sounds to me like Mason was a gentleman from his youth. I mean, really, if certainly a gentleman is someone who cares about people and how they feel. And when you do that as a youth, when you're the type of youth who goes out of their way, which most don't, when you're the type of youth that goes out of your way to befriend people and goes out of your way to make sure that people who seem like they're not doing so hot, you put your arm around them. That sounds like that's who Mason was. That I would be super proud as a dad to have a son like that. And certainly that's what I believe one of the things a gentleman is someone who shows that kindness and roots for the underdog and helps them and all that kind of stuff. So anything else that you'd like to discuss related to what it means to be a gentleman, other than Mason sounds like he was a great one?
Just one other quick thing. Since his accident, I've realized how quickly life events can change. I would encourage any primary breadwinner, while you're healthy, to go get a life insurance policy. I had a term life insurance policy prior to his accident. After his accident, I went and re-upped it. And I was 42 at the time, so I did a term life for the next 20 years. And that just helps me sleep at night, knowing that I'm the primary breadwinner. If something happens to me in the next 20 years for $150 a month, my wife and kids are going to be okay financially. So I think that's something that, if you wait until you're unhealthy, you're not going to be able to get a life insurance policy. So go get one while you're healthy. And, a lot can happen in 20 years that you'll just would be so glad. And I sleep better at night, just knowing that if another accident happens this time to me, that my wife and kids are going to be okay financially. So that maybe that's my accounting background, but just think about, I know it makes you uncomfortable sometimes to think about death, but try to have your ducks in a row if something were to happen.
Thanks, Derrick. Everybody, that's advice from a doctor in accounting. Great advice. One of the things that I was thinking as you were finishing up, Derrick, was an attribute of a gentleman is someone that gives to a community. And you have spoken today to people you don't know. And you've provided value to people that you'll probably never meet. To me, that's a value of a gentleman. You've kind of gone out of your way to talk about something that's tragic and tough for you to talk about, but in advocating for those things like organ donation and blood donation and the things that you're doing as a family now in remembrance of Mason, I think that is an admirable quality of a gentleman, and that was you today. So thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
And my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Derrick, thanks so much for being on the podcast with us. We got to hang out again soon.
Let's do it.
Thanks everybody for joining us on the podcast today. If you felt inspired to share something that you heard today on the podcast, please share it with somebody that you love. I'm Kirk Chug.
And I'm Corey Moore. Have a great week.